On March 11th, 1965, Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian Universalist minister, died from injuries sustained 2 days earlier when white supremacists in Alabama attacked him and two other Unitarian Universalist ministers as they came out of an integrated restaurant in Selma. Reeb and his Unitarian Universalist colleagues had participated in the Selma to Montgomery marches that highlighted the need for states to recognize legally the rights of African Americans to vote. His death affected the nation profoundly. James Reeb was the most prominent white person, probably, to die in the struggle for civil rights. President Lyndon Johnson called both Reeb's wife and father to express his condolences. President Johnson also mentioned James Reeb's name 4 days later when he delivered the Voting Rights Act to Congress. Reeb's martyrdom for civil rights may have tipped the balance in favor of the Voting Rights Act in August 1965. On that same day that Johnson delivered the Voting Rights Act, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a eulogy at a ceremony at Brown's Chapel in Selma. That had met, they had met and participated in civil rights marches and other functions together. Reeb had worked with a lot of civil rights leaders. James Joseph Reeb did not start out in the Unitarian Universalist ministry. He was educated and ordained into the Presbyterian ministry. In that capacity, he worked for a while as a chaplain at a Philadelphia hospital. However, he became dissatisfied with traditional Presbyterian teachings and longed for a more social justice-oriented religious movement. So he transferred his ministerial standing from Presbyterian to Unitarian Universalist. Reeb took a job with the YMCA in Philadelphia and changed the way that African Americans were treated locally. He also chose to live in an African American neighborhood because he believed that one could not make a difference for African Americans while living comfortably in a white community. He later was hired to be assistant minister at All Souls Church, Unitarian, in Washington, D.C., and was ordained into the Unitarian Universalist ministry in 1962. In 1964, Reeb took a job with the American Friends Service Committee and worked on ending housing segregation in Boston. He was well known, though, among civil rights leaders. His death shocked the nation, and a later trial in Alabama with an all-white jury found that the four suspects in his murder were not guilty of his death. Some business leaders later claimed that he was not murdered by a white mob, but rather by civil rights activists themselves. Reeb's death left a widow and four children. His murder technically remains unsolved. Tomorrow is the federal observance of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It seems fitting, therefore, to revisit King's legacy and his own reflection in his eulogy for James Reeb in the light of our own times. We face challenges in our own times that are perhaps even greater than the ones that King and many others faced long ago. Yet, maybe we can draw strength and wisdom from King's thoughts. One of the questions that Martin Luther King asks in his eulogy is, who killed James Reeb? In due course, he resolves that even though individuals could be named, the better question is, what killed James Reeb? He responds, James Reeb was murdered by the indifference of every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained-glass windows. He was murdered by the irrelevancy of a church that will stand amid social evil and serve as a tail light rather than as a headlight, an echo rather than a voice. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician who has moved down the path of demagoguery, who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred, and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the brutality of every sheriff and law enforcement agent who practices lawlessness in the name of the law. He was murdered by the timidity of a federal government that can spend millions of dollars a day to keep troops in South Vietnam, yet cannot protect the lives of its own citizens seeking constitutional rights. Yes, he was even murdered by the cowardice of every Negro who tacitly accepts the evil system of segregation, who stands on the sidelines in the midst of a mighty struggle for justice. In our times, we can acknowledge that most churches in this nation are more focused on a pietistic perspective that encourages members to think only in abstract descriptions of God and Jesus and deny the possibility that the Bible or any other true religion says anything about deity to alleviate suffering or to create a better world. We can all think of politicians who no longer are feeding their constituents fear, hatred, and discrimination in so many ways. This is an ongoing thing in our current times. The problem is that they still believe that the system works and will right itself through democratic means. This is delusion. There are armed, masked men wandering through our nation who have the right to arrest and detain people without charging them with crimes. And we know that the majority of people who are being arrested or detained are people of color. No one even knows their names. These men have no obligation to follow the laws of our nation according to the highest court of the land. Reeb was murdered by a government that spent huge sums of money in those days on a pointless war rather than protecting the lives of its citizens. In our times, health care, food, and shelter have been taken from poorer citizens for tax cuts to the wealthiest citizens. This is an evil system that betrays the true words and values spoken in every major religion, especially Christianity. King tells us that Reeb was murdered by the cowardice of those African Americans who accepted the evil system of segregation and stand on the sidelines. This seems like something that is so dated, yet it is all too true for so many Americans. King is indicting those who are oppressed, though, and just accept their oppression. He does so in a condemning fashion, I believe. He challenges those oppressed people who do not work to relieve their own oppression. I believe that this is harsh. People who are oppressed from oppressed groups often have internal mechanisms given to them by their oppressors and their culture that prevent them from acting in ways that would empower them. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educator who belonged to the nation's liberation pedagogy movement, which was influenced by the liberation spirituality and liberation political movements. Pedagogy is the study of how education is done. Freire is considered the grandfather of critical education theory, which seeks to examine the larger ramifications of what is taught and what that teaching means to society. Freire said that the oppressed people have a cop in the head from their upbringing and educational experience. Oppressed people may believe that they cannot change systems of oppression because they have been taught that people like them have been empowered so well that they oppress themselves. They prevent themselves from acting on uh, their own relief. They are programmed by many layers of systems not to believe in their own ability. One hears that when a person, not a white person, necessarily a white person, who belongs to an oppressed group says something like, "It will never change." They no longer believe that they can improve their life nor the lives of others like them. Instead of scolding people who think like that, I wish that King had given them more words of encouragement. One of the strengths of our religious movement As we know from our history that people like us, Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists, have changed our society. We need to take strength that people like us have changed things, been exemplars who move the world forward. When we learn from our past, we also learn about potential for our times. For people in other communities, that learning might not be as readily accessible. That is a small point to differ with Martin Luther King Jr. about. In the eulogy, he consistently deals with the efforts of people to bring about another era of justice and peace. We are still waiting for that. It seems that our times are actually just as bad or even worse than King's. Now it is true that many more of us live in fear. King responded to this in his time, and his words might strengthen our resolve to face the forces that deny human rights and democracy. King said at James Reeb's memorial service, "So in his death, James Reeb says something to each of us, black and white alike, says that we must substitute courage for caution, says to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered him, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murder. His death says to us that we must work passionately, unrelentingly to make the American dream a reality, so he did not die in vain." It seems like we find ourselves in that same place again as King was in, though over a different situation. On January 7th, Good, an unarmed American citizen, was shot and killed by ICE agents in Minnesota as she attempted to drive home after dropping her child off at school. As my colleague in the Unitarian Universalist ministry, Dan Schatz, writes, "She is not the first to die at the hands of ICE, but as an American citizen and a white woman, her murder has called the attention of a nation. Again, it seems it takes the murder of a white person, much like the death of James Reeb, to bring home the reality of injustice to the larger nation. That sad truth should do nothing to diminish our grief or outrage. Instead, it should open our eyes and hearts to the violence perpetuated increasingly and systematically by agents of the United States government. It should lead us to action not only for bystanders and protesters, but also for human beings brutalized every day in ICE detention centers, their families torn apart, the people abducted from their homes, schools, jobs, and even court appointments." I, like many of you, grow weary with this. There is a pattern in the history of white people in this country. Those white male ICE men, agents, were not doing something extraordinary. They were just doing what has been done since English-speaking white people moved to this continent. It is what English-speaking white men have been doing for more than 400 years in North America. They are the same sort of white men who killed men, women, and children who were indigenous Americans to take their land. They are the same sort of white men who pried black slave children from their weeping mother's arms to be sold to strangers. They are the same sort of white men who fought to take lands from Hispanic people. They are the same sort of white men who joined the KKK and who terrorized people of color and anyone who wanted to make this country freer and fairer. They are the same kinds of white men who killed James Reeb. Because most of these people and the people in government were and are still white men, it seems very likely that very few of them will ever be accountable for their crimes against humanity. That just doesn't happen very often to white men in this country. This is the same old in the United States. I will stop talking about history when it stops repeating itself. The challenge of our times is not to imitate Martin Luther King Jr. Our times are similar, but different. Our faith, though, is still an optimistic faith that has confidence that with our efforts, our society can become the land of promise for all that it has never been. We, Unitarian Universalists, have been there as a faith community, encouraging progress in science and in society, and we will be there. It seems fitting to end today with the words of Martin Luther King Jr., adapted from his eulogy for James Reeb. He reminds us of a great vision of what the United States could be, and we must hold this to our hearts in these times. King said, "We must work right here and all over the United States till people everywhere will respect the dignity and worth of human personalities. We must work with all our hearts to establish a society where men will be, that out of one blood God made all men to dwell upon the face of the earth. We must work with determination for that great day. Justice will roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. We must work right here, where every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places straight. The glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. We must work to make the Declaration of Independence real in our everyday lives. In this struggle for equality and justice, may love prevail, and may we, Unitarian Universalists and others, found a society that speaks to the best in the human spirit. So be it. Blessed be. Amen.